Thanos collected all 6 Infinity Stones, assembled the most powerful weapon in the universe, and stood at the center of existence ready to erase half of all life with a single snap. And every hero who tried to stop him either failed, bled out, or watched helplessly as the universe folded around his fist. The Avengers lost. The Guardians lost. Even the combined power of Wakanda, sorcerers, and gods couldn't slow him down. But what if the multiverse had one more card to play, not a smarter hero, not a stronger weapon, not a better plan, just a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who shows up, looks Thanos dead in the eye, and feels absolutely nothing? If you've ever wanted to see the most overpowered being in anime history walk into the Marvel Universe and completely break it, not with strategy, not with sacrifice, not with a heroic speech, but with sheer, unfeeling, unstoppable boredom, then you need to watch this entire video, because what happens when Saitama meets Thanos isn't just a power fantasy. It's a philosophical collision that neither universe was built to survive. Drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. To understand why Saitama being sent to stop Thanos is the most chaotic and quietly terrifying crossover the multiverse could produce, you first have to understand what each of these beings actually represents at their core. Not just their power level, not just their feats, but what they mean within the logic of their own universe. Because when you place them side by side, you realize that they aren't just two strong characters from different franchises. They are two completely opposite answers to the same question, and that question is, what happens when a single individual becomes so powerful that the world around them no longer has the ability to respond? Thanos spent decades, maybe centuries depending on which timeline you follow, building toward a singular vision. He watched his home world of Titan collapse under the weight of overpopulation and resource depletion. He proposed a solution that the people of Titan rejected as madness, and then he watched every single one of his predictions come true as his civilization crumbled into dust and silence. That experience didn't break him, or rather, it did break him, but it broke him in a very specific direction, the direction of absolute certainty. From that moment forward, Thanos operated with the unshakable conviction that he was right, that the universe was sick, that life itself was the disease, and that he, uniquely, cosmically, was the cure. Every army he raised, every planet he halved, every ally he gathered, and every enemy he destroyed was in service of that one idea, and the Infinity Stones were simply the mechanism through which he intended to make that idea permanent and universal and undeniable. What makes Thanos terrifying in the context of the Marvel Universe isn't just his physical strength, though that is genuinely extraordinary. It's the fact that he has a reason. He has a philosophy. He has looked at existence and made a considered, deliberate, deeply felt argument about what should be done with it, and he is willing to sacrifice literally everything, including the one being he loved, to see that argument through to its conclusion. When he snapped his fingers at the end of Infinity War and half of all life in the universe dissolved into ash, it wasn't an act of cruelty in his mind. It was an act of mercy, a gift to the survivors, a corrective surgery performed on a universe that had been suffering for too long. He sat down on a farm afterward and watched the sunrise with something that looked genuinely, disturbingly like peace. Now take Saitama. Take everything that makes Thanos who he is, the centuries of purpose, the burning conviction, the philosophical architecture, the emotional investment in the outcome, and remove every single one of those things. Saitama is a man who became the strongest being in his universe completely by accident, through a training regimen so absurdly simple that it loops back around to being almost a joke, and in the process of becoming that strong, he lost the one thing that made strength feel worth having. He can't feel the thrill of a fight anymore. He can't feel danger. He can't feel the rising tension of a battle that might go either way, because no battle has ever gone either way for him. Every fight ends the moment he decides to end it, and the ending is always the same, and the sameness has hollowed him out into something that wears the face of a hero, but experiences the emotional register of someone who has been waiting in line at the DMV for about 3 years now. He doesn't fight because he believes in something. He doesn't fight because he has a plan or a mission or a burning sense of justice that keeps him going in the dark moments. He fights because fighting is what he does, and even that reason has started to feel thin and distant and slightly absurd. He showed up to be a hero because he wanted to feel something, and becoming the strongest hero in existence took that feeling away from him permanently. And now he just exists, immovably and incomprehensibly, in a universe that cannot touch him and cannot challenge him and cannot give him back the one thing he actually wants. So when the multiverse cracks open, and in this story, it does crack open, because the sheer gravitational weight of the Infinity Gauntlet operating at full power creates fractures in the fabric between realities that the Ancient One detects from her sanctum, fractures that Doctor Strange reads in the mirror dimension like fault lines spreading through glass. Fractures that pull at the edges of other universes and threaten to drag their physics and their people and their rules into a collision with the Marvel reality. When that crack opens, what falls through is not another hero with a plan. What falls through is a man who was on his way to the grocery store. He wasn't summoned in any dramatic sense. There was no ritual, no sacrifice, no desperate final gambit from a dying Strange reaching across dimensions with his last breath. The crack in reality simply opened in the airspace above the battlefield on Titan, right in the middle of the chaos where Iron Man was bleeding and Spider-Man was struggling, and Doctor Strange was counting outcomes. And Saitama fell through it the same way you might fall through a trapdoor, suddenly, without warning, and with the specific expression of someone who is mildly annoyed rather than afraid. He landed on the surface of Titan the way he always lands, boots first, a small crater spreading outward from the impact point, dust rising in a slow ring around him, cape fluttering in the thin alien atmosphere. And he looked around at the ruins of a dead civilization, at the suspended debris of a shattered moon hanging in the sky, at the assembled heroes of the Marvel Universe bleeding and gasping and regrouping, and at the enormous purple figure standing at the center of it all with a golden gauntlet blazing with the light of 6 collected fragments of universal power, and Saitama's expression did not change. He tilted his head slightly. He looked at the gauntlet. He looked at Thanos. He scratched the back of his head. Iron Man's suit was screaming damage alerts across every sensor in the armor. Strange had already reviewed 14 million possible futures and found only one in which the heroes won. The Guardians were scattered and bleeding. Spider-Man was still tangled in debris from the last exchange. And into the middle of all of this walked, or rather fell, a man in a yellow tracksuit with a white cape, who looked at the most powerful being in the Marvel Universe and had absolutely nothing to say. Thanos noticed him, of course. Thanos noticed everything. The gauntlet gave him perception beyond normal senses, and even without it, he was not the kind of being who missed the sudden appearance of an unknown variable in the middle of his most important moment. He turned, slowly and with the specific deliberateness of someone who has never had to hurry, and he looked at Saitama the way a chess grandmaster might look at a stray cat that had wandered onto the board, with acknowledgement, with the automatic calculation of threat level, and with a conclusion reached almost instantly that placed this particular variable somewhere in the category of irrelevance. He was wrong about that. He would continue to be wrong about that for the next several minutes in ways that would systematically dismantle every assumption he had ever made about the nature of power and resistance and the architecture of the universe itself. But in that first moment, looking at a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who appeared to have arrived from nowhere, and who was currently looking at him with the specific expression of someone trying to remember if they left the stove on, Thanos felt nothing but mild curiosity and the distant, almost affectionate condescension of an apex predator, observing something that has wandered very far outside its natural habitat. "Another champion," Thanos said, and his voice carried across the broken surface of Titan like a physical thing, deep and resonant and absolutely certain of itself. Sent by fate, perhaps, or desperation. He looked at Saitama for a moment longer. "It doesn't matter." And Saitama looked back at him, and the universe held its breath, and the heroes of the Marvel universe, bleeding and broken and running out of time and out of miracles, watched from a distance as the two most powerful beings ever to occupy the same space in any universe stood 40 feet apart on a dead planet. And the one who had no idea what he was dealing with was not the one wearing the yellow jumpsuit. Thanos did not rush. He never rushed. Rushing was something lesser beings did when they were afraid of what would happen if they slowed down, and Thanos had not been afraid of anything in a very long time, possibly ever, because fear requires the acknowledgement that an outcome exists which you cannot control. And Thanos had spent his entire life constructing a worldview in which every outcome, every variable, every possible resistance was ultimately something that bent to sufficient power and sufficient will. He had fought gods. He had broken armies. He had taken a point-blank blast from every weapon Tony Stark could generate simultaneously and walked through it like a man walking through a light rain, mildly wet but fundamentally unmoved. So he looked at Saitama, and he calculated, and the calculation came back the same way it always came back when he looked at something new, as a question not of whether he could defeat it, but of how much force would be required, and whether that force was worth spending before the main event. He decided it wasn't worth much, maybe one stone, maybe just his fist. He chose his fist, because there was something almost respectful about that, something that acknowledged the presence of another physical being without immediately resorting to the reality-warping, time-bending, soul-extracting capabilities of the gauntlet. It was, in the context of Thanos' internal logic, a courtesy, the same way a professional fighter might choose not to immediately go for the knockout against an unknown opponent, but instead let the fight develop, let the other person show what they have, let the exchange mean something before ending it. He stepped forward, and the ground cracked under his boot, and he pulled his arm back and swung with the kind of force that had previously sent Thor skidding across the floor of the Statesman like a rag doll, the kind of force that had caved in Iron Man's armor with a single blow, and his fist connected with the side of Saitama's face with a sound like a shockwave detonating in a closed room. Tony Stark, watching from 40 meters away through a cracked faceplate, saw the impact and felt his stomach drop. Strange lowered his eyes. Mantis turned away. It was the kind of blow that didn't require anyone to check on the outcome. They had all seen what Thanos' fists did to things, and none of them wanted to watch another version of that ending play out on someone who had barely arrived. Saitama's head turned slightly to the left. That was it. That was the entire observable effect of Thanos hitting Saitama with a blow that could have restructured the geology of a small moon. His head moved maybe 15 degrees to the left, his cape fluttered, and then his head turned back to center, and he looked at Thanos with the expression of a man who has just been lightly tapped on the shoulder by someone trying to get his attention in a crowded room, mild acknowledgement, no alarm, the very faint and distant suggestion of interest. Thanos stared. This was a new data point. The calculation ran again, faster this time, reassigning variables, re-examining the threat category, pulling in new parameters. The being in front of him had absorbed a blow that should have liquefied bone and organ, and sent whatever remained skipping across the surface of Titan like a stone across water, and the visible result was a slight head turn. That meant either the being had some form of invulnerability that Thanos had not detected, or it had a regenerative capability operating at a speed beyond immediate perception. Or, and this was the option that the calculation kept returning to and kept rejecting, because it did not fit within the architecture of anything Thanos understood about the universe. It had simply not been affected because the force of the blow was not, for this particular being, a meaningful quantity. He hit him again, harder, with both fists this time, brought together in a downward hammering blow that drove a shockwave into the ground and sent cracks spidering outward across the rock in every direction for 30 meters. The kind of blow that would have split a mountain, that would have ended a planet if applied to the right fault line. Saitama stumbled back half a step. He looked down at his feet, then back up at Thanos, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not pain, not fear, not even real surprise, but something closer to the mild, detached interest of a person who has just encountered a minor novelty, the way you might look at a vending machine that gave you an extra bag of chips. He reached up and touched his cheek with 2 fingers, not because it hurt, but apparently just to check that something had happened at all. "Huh," he said, and that was the first word Saitama spoke in the Marvel Universe, delivered with the enthusiasm and cosmic weight of a man commenting on the weather being slightly different from what he expected. Thanos activated the Power Stone. Now this was different. This was not a courtesy. The Power Stone amplified physical force to a degree that the mathematics of a single universe could barely contain. It was the distilled essence of all physical energy in existence, concentrated into a single gem and channeled through the gauntlet into whatever Thanos chose to direct it at. When he had used it against the Hulk, Banner's alter ego, the strongest purely physical being the Marvel Universe had produced through biological means. The fight had lasted approximately 30 seconds and ended with the Hulk so thoroughly overwhelmed that he refused to come back out for the rest of the film. When combined with Thanos' own strength, the Power Stone didn't just hit things, it unmade them at a structural level. It disrupted the integrity of matter itself. It applied force in amounts that had no natural analog in normal physical reality. Thanos hit Saitama with the Power Stone active and put every ounce of his strength behind it, and the impact created a crater 60 meters wide and sent a shockwave across the surface of Titan that knocked everyone else off their feet and briefly, terrifyingly, shifted the orbital trajectory of a chunk of suspended moon debris overhead. The dust settled slowly. The crater was deep and wide, and the rock at its center had been compressed and fused into something almost glass-like from the heat and force of the impact. Everyone who was still conscious looked at the crater. Nobody spoke. Strange's hands were suspended mid-gesture where he had been about to cast something, now frozen in the still moment of waiting to find out if there was anything left to cast for. Saitama walked out of the crater. He was brushing dust off his shoulder. His cape had a new scorch mark on it, which seemed to mildly annoy him more than the impact itself had, and he looked at the mark for a moment with the specific expression of someone calculating whether dry cleaning was going to be a thing they had to deal with. Then he looked up at Thanos, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite boredom. It was the very early, very tentative, extremely cautious flicker of something that might, if conditions were right, eventually develop into mild engagement. Thanos was not calculating anymore. Thanos was staring. And in the long history of Thanos staring at things, this particular stare was categorically different from every other one, because it was the first stare in his existence that contained, buried under layers of discipline and certainty, and cultivated impassivity, the faint and deeply unwelcome signal of something he did not have a name for yet, but which was, in its essential nature, the very early stage of concern. He had used the Power Stone. He had put his full strength behind it. He had created a geological event on the surface of a dead planet, and the being standing in front of him was annoyed about his cape. He activated the Space Stone and hit Saitama with a compressed gravitational shear, a technique that essentially folded space around a target and applied the force of collapsing geometry from every direction simultaneously, the spatial equivalent of being squeezed by the fabric of reality itself. Saitama's boots slid back maybe 2 feet. He looked down at them again with the same checking expression as before, apparently confirming to himself that yes, something was technically occurring, even if it was not occurring in any way that registered as significant. Tony Stark, who had been watching all of this from a distance while his suit ran increasingly frantic damage assessments on itself, said something that his AI logged as unprintable, and turned to Strange with the expression of a man whose entire model of the universe had just been respectfully but thoroughly invalidated. Strange was already watching with the careful, precise attention of someone who had reviewed 14 million futures, and was now watching a 15th unfold that hadn't appeared in any of them, which meant he was in territory where his preparation meant nothing, and his only advantage was observation. Thanos took a step back. It was subtle, barely perceptible, more a shift in weight than an actual retreat, but it was there, and it was the first time in the entire sequence of events across both Infinity War and this moment that Thanos had moved in any direction that was not toward something. He looked at Saitama with all 4 active stones blazing in the gauntlet, and he made the specific face of a man who has just opened a door expecting a room, and found instead an absence of room, an absence of wall, an absence of any of the structural features that rooms and walls and doors are supposed to imply. Saitama rolled his neck. There was an audible crack. He looked at Thanos with the expression he always wore right before a fight shifted from being a thing he was tolerating into being a thing that had, against all reasonable expectation, gotten slightly interesting. "Okay," Saitama said, "your turn's over." There's a moment in every fight, every real fight, not the choreographed exchanges of trained opponents who understand each other's rhythms, but the raw and unpredictable collision of 2 things that have never met before, where one side realizes that what they brought to the encounter is not going to be enough, and the realization doesn't come as a single clean thought, but as a spreading, creeping awareness that moves through the body before it reaches the mind, tightening the chest and slowing the breath and making every subsequent action feel slightly more desperate than the one before it, even when the face remains composed and the movements remain deliberate and everything on the outside still looks like confidence. Thanos reached that moment when Saitama walked out of the crater. He didn't show it, because Thanos had spent centuries constructing a version of himself that did not show things, but the awareness was there, moving through him like cold water finding the cracks in stone, and it changed the nature of everything he did next. He activated all 6 stones simultaneously. This was not a decision he made lightly, and in the context of everything Thanos had done up to this point, it represented a significant escalation, not because he doubted the outcome, not yet, not entirely, but because the unknown variable standing 40 feet away from him had already invalidated 2 data points that he had considered reliable, and Thanos was not the kind of being who allowed unknown variables to accumulate. He would resolve this now, completely and finally, and then return to the work that actually mattered. The gauntlet blazed with a light that was less a color than a statement. All 6 stones operating in concert produced an effect that the human eye wasn't really built to process, something that existed at the intersection of every force in the universe operating simultaneously, reality and space and time and power and mind and soul, all channeled through a single point and directed at a single target. What he did next was not simply hit Saitama again. He restructured the local reality around Saitama. He used the reality stone to alter the fundamental nature of the space Saitama occupied, turning the air into something that wasn't air, turning the ground into something that wasn't ground, essentially reaching into the fabric of what was real and rewriting the paragraph that contained Saitama's existence. He layered the space stone over that to compress the altered reality inward, collapsing the rewritten space around Saitama from every direction at once. He used the power stone to amplify the force of that compression to a level that had no natural analog anywhere in the universe. He used the time stone to accelerate the process, making it happen faster than any physical response could counter. He used the mind stone to attempt to reach into whatever cognitive structure Saitama operated from and simply turn it off, the way you might flip a breaker, the way he had reached into vision and extracted the stone from his forehead without ceremony or effort. And then, because he was Thanos, and because thoroughness was the closest thing he had to a religion, he wrapped all of that in the Soul Stone, the most mysterious and arguably most powerful of the six. The stone that had cost him everything he loved to acquire. The stone that existed at the boundary between being and not being, and gave him access to the essential animating force that made a living thing rather than just an arrangement of matter. The result was an event that the surviving heroes of the Marvel Universe would later struggle to describe in any language that made coherent sense. A simultaneous assault on every level of Saitama's existence, physical and spatial and temporal and cognitive and spiritual and real, all of it hitting at once in a convergence of force that should have, by every law and principle and precedent in the Marvel Universe, simply ended whatever was on the receiving end of it in every way that a thing could be ended. The light cleared, the distortion in reality settled, the compressed space released, the time acceleration faded, the soul-reaching withdrew. Saitama was standing in exactly the same position he had been standing in before. His expression had shifted very slightly, not toward pain or fear, or the dazed disorientation of someone who had just been hit by the combined force of 6 Infinity Stones, but toward something more like the expression of a person who has just sat through a very long and elaborate magic show and is waiting to find out if there's a point coming or if this is just the whole thing. He looked at the gauntlet. He looked at Thanos. He scratched his chin with one finger in the specific gesture of someone working through mild confusion, not about their own situation, but about the logic of what they're observing. "What are those things?" he asked, nodding toward the gauntlet. And the question was completely genuine, not rhetorical, not dismissive, just the straightforward inquiry of a person who has encountered an unfamiliar object and wants basic information about it, delivered with the same tone you might use to ask someone what kind of phone case they're using. Thanos said nothing. This was new territory for him in a way that the words new territory cannot fully capture, because Thanos had operated in new territory before. He had encountered beings and forces and situations that fell outside his prior experience and had adapted to them, had recalculated and redirected and overcome. But this was different from new territory in the way that standing at the edge of a map is different from discovering that the map was wrong about whether the edge existed at all. Every framework he had for understanding power and resistance, and the structure of existence had just been applied at maximum capacity to a single target, and the target had responded by asking a clarifying question. Strange, watching from behind a shield of sling ring energy, processed what he had just witnessed with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that fundamentally revised his model of what was possible. He had reviewed 14 million futures and found one in which the heroes won, and he had been operating under the assumption that he understood the shape of that future, even if he couldn't see all the details. What he was watching now was not inside the shape of any future he had reviewed, which meant either the multiverse had introduced a variable that his viewing hadn't accounted for, or the future he had identified was accessible through a path he hadn't recognized, and both of those possibilities required him to completely reconsider everything he thought he knew about how this day was going to go. Tony Stark had stopped trying to run tactical assessments through his suit's AI because the AI kept returning errors, not system errors, but logical errors, the kind that occur when you ask a system to evaluate a situation using parameters the system was not designed to accommodate. The suit had a comprehensive database of known threats, known power levels, known physical limits for every category of being the Avengers had ever encountered, and Saitama didn't fit into any of the categories in any of the ways the database expected. So the assessment kept coming back as inconclusive, which was a word Tony Stark's threat assessment system had never returned before in the entire history of its operation. Thanos activated the Reality Stone alone this time, not as part of a combined assault, but as a precise, targeted application of its most fundamental capability, which was the ability to make something that was real into something that wasn't, to reach into the texture of existence and simply delete a thread from the weave. He had used it on Drax and Mantis earlier in the day, turning them into objects, removing their agency and their physicality with a casual ease that demonstrated better than any show of force how complete his control over reality had become. He reached that same capability toward Saitama with the specific intent of turning him into something inanimate, not killing him, because killing required the target to be a living thing, and Thanos was no longer entirely certain what category this target fell into, but simply changing what he was at a fundamental level. The stone flared. The air around Saitama shimmered with that distinctive unreality that the reality stone produced, the visual distortion of the world deciding to be something other than itself. And then the shimmer faded, and Saitama was still Saitama, standing in the same place in the same yellow jumpsuit with the same mildly expectant expression. And the reality stone in the gauntlet flickered, actually flickered, like a light with a loose connection, which was something that the reality stone had never done in the entire history of its existence, because it was an infinity stone, and infinity stones did not have loose connections. They were the foundational constants of the universe, and they did not flicker. Saitama looked at the gauntlet again, more carefully this time, because the flickering had apparently registered to him as mildly interesting. Not the assault on his existence, but the flickering of the stone, the way you might not notice a boulder thrown at your head but look up when you hear an unfamiliar mechanical sound. That one looked like it glitched, he said, with the tone of someone pointing out a minor software bug, not expecting it to be a significant observation, but offering it in case it was useful. The reason the stone glitched, the reason all 6 stones had failed in sequence against a single target, was something that neither Thanos nor Strange nor any being in the Marvel Universe had a framework for understanding yet, but which was written into the fundamental nature of what Saitama was, what he had become on the other side of that training that had cost him his hair and his ability to feel the normal texture of existence. Saitama didn't have a power level. He didn't have an upper limit. He didn't have a ceiling that the stones could locate and push against, because the stones worked by finding the boundary of what something was, and then operating at or beyond that boundary. And Saitama's boundary was not a fixed point. It was not a fixed anything. It was an absence of fixedness, a bottomlessness that the stones kept reaching into and kept failing to find the bottom of, and a tool that works by finding the bottom of things cannot work on something that has no bottom. The power stone amplified force, but amplification is a multiplier, and multiplying infinity produces infinity, and the stones were not designed to operate in the presence of actual infinity. They were designed to operate at the extreme upper range of the finite, and there is a categorical difference between those two things that the stones were now, in real time and for the first time in their existence, being forced to confront. Thanos looked at the gauntlet. He looked at Saitama. And then he did something that, across all his centuries of existence and all his campaigns and all his victories, and all his carefully constructed certainty about the nature of power and the structure of the universe, he did something he had never done before in any context or for any reason. He took a full step backward, not a weight shift, not a tactical repositioning, a step back. And Saitama finally, slowly, let out a breath that might, in the right light, interpreted generously, have contained the very faintest trace of something resembling anticipation. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when the fighting stops but the danger hasn't, when both sides are still present and still capable, and the tension hasn't resolved, but has instead shifted into something more complicated and more still. A silence that is less the absence of sound than the presence of a held breath. And that was the silence that settled over the broken surface of Titan when Thanos took that step backward and Saitama stood there not advancing, not retreating, not doing anything in particular except existing in the way he always existed, completely, immovably, without apparent awareness of or investment in the significance of the moment. The heroes of the Marvel Universe, scattered across the rubble at various distances and various states of damage, did not speak. Strange did not move. Tony did not activate a new weapon. Everyone who was conscious was watching, and the watching had taken on a quality that was different from the watching you do during a fight. It was the watching you do when you realize that what is happening in front of you is something you don't have a category for yet, and your only available response is to observe it as carefully as possible and hope that the category eventually reveals itself. Thanos spoke first. This was, in itself, a departure from the pattern. Thanos was not a being who explained himself to opponents mid-conflict, not because he was incapable of articulation, but because explanation implied that the other party's understanding mattered to the outcome, and usually it didn't. He had spoken at length to Doctor Strange about the nature of his mission and the logic of his plan, but that had been from a position of complete control, the monologue of a man who has already won explaining the winning to someone who has already lost. This was different. This was the careful, probing opening of a conversation initiated not from strength, but from the specific intellectual discomfort of encountering something you cannot fit into your existing map of the world. "You feel no pain," Thanos said, and it came out less as an accusation and more as an observation being tested against reality, the verbal equivalent of pressing on something to see if it's solid. He was watching Saitama with an attention that was qualitatively different from how he had looked at any other opponent. Not the calculating assessment of a predator measuring prey, not the contemptuous acknowledgement of a god looking down at mortals, but something closer to the focused, almost reluctant curiosity of a scholar encountering a text that contradicts everything in their established canon. Saitama considered this for a moment with the air of someone being asked a question they haven't thought about recently and need to check the answer to. "Not from that, no," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, the specific qualification of "not from that," rather than just "no," that carried a weight he almost certainly didn't intend, because it implied that pain was not an absent concept for him, just absent from this particular context, which meant it existed somewhere else in his experience, in some category that a gauntlet full of infinity stones apparently didn't touch. Thanos studied him. "Then what do you feel?" And Saitama looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read, not because it was guarded or complex, but because it was the expression of someone who has been asked a question with a genuinely simple answer that happens to be a kind of answer most people don't expect, the expression of someone about to say something true that will sound, in context, almost absurd. "Nothing, mostly," he said. "That's kind of the problem." The silence that followed that statement had a different texture than the silence before it. Strange, who had been tracking the conversation with the same careful attention he brought to reading spells in languages he didn't fully understand, processed those 3 words and felt something shift in his understanding of what was happening on this battlefield. Not a complete picture yet, but the beginning of one, the first lines of a shape emerging from what had previously been fog. Tony, whose suit was still running its inconclusive assessments, heard Saitama say nothing, mostly, and felt the specific cognitive dissonance of a man who has built his entire identity around the idea that being the smartest person in the room is a form of power, suddenly confronted with the possibility that intelligence and preparation and technology and 10 years of accumulated superhero experience were all, in the current context, roughly as relevant as a strongly worded letter. Thanos moved not toward Saitama, but sideways, a slow lateral movement that was less combat maneuvering and more the packing of a being working through something difficult, the physical expression of a mind in motion. "I have taken everything from worlds," he said, and his voice had changed, still deep, still resonant, still carrying that quality of absolute self-possession, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, a current of something that in a lesser being you might have called uncertainty, but in Thanos registered more as the controlled acknowledgement of a problem that resists his usual solutions. "I have ended civilizations, broken armies, killed gods." Every being I have ever encountered has understood, at some level, what it meant to lose, has felt the weight of what I represented, the finality of what I could do. He stopped packing and looked at Saitama directly. You don't. I mean, I get that you're trying to do something, Saitama said, with the tone of a person being fair. The glove thing, the whole wiping out half of everything, I heard some of these guys talking about it while I was trying to figure out where I landed. He glanced briefly at the assembled heroes, then back at Thanos. That's a lot of effort for something that sounds like it doesn't actually fix the problem. Thanos' eyes narrowed very slightly. You understand nothing about the problem. I understand that you spent a really long time on this, Saitama said, and he wasn't being dismissive. Or rather, he was being dismissive in the specific way he was dismissive about everything, which was less active contempt and more the passive indifference of someone for whom the scale of a thing stopped registering as meaningful a long time ago. Collecting all of those, fighting everyone, having a whole plan. He paused, searching for the word with the air of someone trying to be accurate rather than kind. That's a lot. He looked at the gauntlet again. Did it feel like anything while you were doing it? And this question, delivered without strategy, without the intent to wound or destabilize, with nothing behind it except the genuine, slightly tired curiosity of a man who thinks about this kind of thing more than anyone would guess from looking at him. This question landed somewhere in Thanos that no physical blow, no sorcery, no combined assault from every hero on the battlefield had managed to reach. Because it was the right question, the question that cut directly to the thing Thanos had built an entire cosmology around without ever examining too closely, the foundational experience that had set everything in motion, whether what he felt in the pursuit of his mission was meaning, or whether it was something else wearing meaning's face. It gave me purpose, Thanos said, and the answer came slightly too quickly, with slightly too much firmness, in the way that answers come when the question has touched something that the answerer has decided must not be examined. The universe required correction. I was the only one willing to make it. But did it feel like anything? Saitama said again, not letting the deflection land, not because he was being confrontational, but because he was genuinely asking, because the distinction between having a purpose and feeling something while pursuing it was a distinction he understood from the inside in a way that no one who hadn't stood where he stood could fully appreciate. Because I had a goal too. Train every day, become a hero, be the strongest. And I did it, and at the end I was definitely the strongest, and he looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. There was nothing there. I kept waiting for it to feel like something, and it just didn't. The battlefield was completely silent. Not the tense silence of before, but something deeper and stranger. The silence of a conversation that had drifted far outside the territory anyone had expected it to occupy. The silence of every person present realizing simultaneously that they were witnessing something that wasn't a fight anymore and wasn't quite a conversation in any normal sense, but was something in between, something that didn't have a name. Two beings who had arrived at the same impossible location from completely opposite directions, standing in the wreckage of a dead civilization, having the kind of exchange that only becomes possible when all the normal buffers between people, status and fear, and the performance of confidence, have been stripped away by the simple, blunt fact that neither of them is capable of hurting the other. Thanos looked at Saitama for a long time, and what moved through him in that silence was something that his philosophy, his centuries of certainty, his elaborately constructed worldview had not prepared him for. Not anger, not dismissal, not the defensive hardening of a position being challenged, but the cold and unwelcome and impossible to ignore recognition of a mirror. Not a perfect mirror. Their trajectories were different, their methods were different, the scale of what they had done was different, but a mirror in the specific sense that the thing Saitama was describing, the hollowness at the center of achieved purpose, the silence where the feeling was supposed to be, was something Thanos had been circling for centuries without ever letting himself look directly at it. He had told himself it was peace. Sitting on that farm after the snap, watching the sunrise, feeling the quiet that followed the completion of his life's work. He had named that feeling peace, had held it up as the justification for everything, had pointed to it as evidence that he had been right. But peace and emptiness are not the same thing, and in the specific, unguarded, unexpectedly honest space of this conversation with a being who had no reason to flatter him, and no capacity to threaten him, and no agenda beyond the blunt expression of his own experience, Thanos felt the possibility, distant, uncomfortable, flickering at the edge of his awareness like the reality stone had flickered under Saitama's inexplicable resistance. That what he had been sitting with on that farm was not peace at all. Strange watched Thanos' face during this silence, and saw something there that he had not seen in any of the 14 million futures he had reviewed. Something that none of his preparation or his power or his knowledge of the mystic arts had given him the ability to produce. A crack. Not a physical crack, not a tactical opening, but a crack in the absolute certainty that made Thanos Thanos. A hairline fracture in the foundation of the conviction that had carried him across decades and galaxies to this moment, introduced not by force or strategy or sacrifice, but by a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit asking a simple question with genuine curiosity and no idea how much weight it carried. Tony Stark, who had built his entire life on the idea that the right application of intelligence and technology could solve any problem, looked at what was happening between Saitama and Thanos and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the least interesting person in a conversation he was technically part of. Saitama scratched the back of his head. "Anyway," he said, with the specific energy of a person who has had a moment of unexpected depth and is now gently returning to the surface, "you should probably put the glove down." The thing about Thanos is that he always finished what he started. This was not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. It wasn't the blind persistence of someone who couldn't adapt or the pride of someone who couldn't admit a mistake. It was something more structural than that, something built into the foundational architecture of who he was and how he moved through the world. He had a mission. The mission was the organizing principle around which every other aspect of his existence had been arranged for as long as he could remember, the fixed point that everything else orbited, the thing that gave the centuries of effort and sacrifice and lost their shape and their meaning. And a mission, by definition, does not stop because the conversation got uncomfortable. A mission does not pause because an unexpected variable walked through a crack in reality and asked a question that landed somewhere tender. Thanos had sacrificed Gamora for the Soul Stone, and if that hadn't stopped him, nothing was going to stop him. Certainly not the philosophical equivalent of a mirror being held up at an inconvenient angle by a man who appeared to have bought his entire wardrobe from a clearance rack at a sporting goods store. So he moved. Not the slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial movement of a being who has all the time in the world and knows it. This was faster, more direct. The movement of someone who has identified a window and intends to use it before it closes. And the window he had identified was the one that had always been there. The one that no amount of physical resistance or philosophical conversation could close, which was simply the fact that the Infinity Gauntlet still worked, that the stones still held their power, that the snap was still possible, and that whatever Saitama was and whatever he was immune to, he was standing on a planet in a universe populated by beings who were not immune to anything, beings who would dissolve into ash the moment the fingers came together. Beings whose existence was the entire point of what he was doing, and the doing of it was what mattered, not the feeling of it, not the peace afterward, not any of the things the conversation had stirred up in him. The doing of it was what he had come here for. His hand came up, the gauntlet blazed. Every stone lit simultaneously, the blue of the space stone, the red of the reality stone, the purple of the power stone, the green of the time stone, the yellow of the mind stone, the orange of the soul stone, all of them firing together in the convergent light that meant the snap was coming, that the gesture was forming, that the universe was about to be divided in half by the closing of a fist. And everyone on the battlefield, who understood what that light meant, felt the bottom drop out of their stomach in the same instant. Strange moved. He threw every binding spell he had left, crimson bands of Sidorak unspooling from his hands in thick red loops aimed at the gauntlet hand, trying to freeze the fingers before they could complete the motion. Tony fired every remaining weapon in the suit simultaneously, not because he thought it would stop anything, but because doing something was the only alternative to watching, and he was constitutionally incapable of just watching. Mantis grabbed Drax's arm. Nebula closed her eyes. Peter Parker, who had been semi-conscious in the rubble 30 meters away, opened his eyes at the sound of the gauntlet charging and saw the light, and understood what it meant, and felt the specific terror of someone who is too far away and too slow, and knows both of those things with complete clarity. Saitama watched Thanos raise the gauntlet, and something happened in his expression that was different from everything that had come before it. Not the mild curiosity of before, not the detached observation, not the almost apologetic patience of someone waiting for a situation to become interesting enough to engage with fully. What moved across his face in that moment was something quieter and more serious, a settling, a decision being made not dramatically but completely, the way decisions get made when you've run out of reasons to delay them. He had been standing on this dead planet for several minutes now, and he had been hit by things that should have destroyed him, and asked questions that had landed somewhere he hadn't intended them to land, and had a conversation that he hadn't expected to have, and had felt, in the middle of all of it, the very faint and tentative and carefully unacknowledged possibility that this situation was maybe, possibly, the first thing in a very long time that had engaged something in him that wasn't entirely numb. And now the man he had been talking to was about to end half of all the lives in this universe, and the people around him were terrified, and the terror was real and visible and human in a way that registered to Saitama not as an abstraction but as a specific, present, immediate thing. These people, right here, right now, were afraid, and the fear was the kind that comes from caring about being alive, from having things to go back to, from existing in a universe that still felt like it had texture and stakes and meaning. And Saitama, who had lost most of that texture from his own experience, recognized it with the specific clarity of someone who knows what a thing looks like because they remember having it. He didn't make a speech. He didn't announce himself. He didn't take a stance or charge up or give any of the visual signals that, in the grammar of superhero storytelling, indicate that the decisive moment is arriving. He just moved, and the movement was so fast that it didn't register to anyone present as movement at all. It registered as discontinuity, as Saitama being in one place and then being in another place with no observable transition between the two states, the visual equivalent of a film with a frame missing. One moment he was standing where he had been standing, and the next moment his hand was around Thanos' gauntlet hand, fingers wrapped around the wrist just below the stone settings, holding it in the specific grip of someone who is not applying force yet, but is making it unambiguously clear that force is available. Thanos' fingers were a centimeter from completing the snap, 1 centimeter. The stones were fully charged. The gesture was 95% formed. The motion was already in progress and should have been, by every physical law governing momentum and the operation of the gauntlet, impossible to stop at this stage. You do not catch a bullet by grabbing the barrel after it's been fired. You do not interrupt a snap by seizing the wrist when the fingers are already moving. Physics does not allow for the kind of intervention that had just occurred because the timing required would place it firmly in the category of things that cannot happen. Saitama's grip tightened, not crushingly, not yet, but with the deliberate, controlled, communicative pressure of someone making a point rather than making a crater. The gauntlet groaned. Not metaphorically, the actual physical structure of the gauntlet, forged in the heart of a dying star by the greatest craftsman in the universe, specifically to withstand the power of 6 infinity stones operating simultaneously, produced an audible sound under Saitama's grip that was exactly the sound you would expect from something being asked to bear a load it was not designed to bear. The metal flexed. Hairline fractures appeared at two of the stone settings, thin as spider silk and absolutely unambiguous in their implication. The stones flickered again. All six this time, simultaneously, the same loose connection flicker that the reality stone had produced alone earlier. And this close, with Saitama's hand around the gauntlet, the flickering was more pronounced, less a momentary instability and more a sustained, troubled uncertainty. Six of the most powerful objects in the universe communicating in the only language available to them, which was the language of light and energy, that they were in contact with something they could not process. Something that fell outside the parameters they had been operating within since the beginning of the universe. Something that their power could not locate the edge of, and therefore could not act upon with any reliability. Thanos looked at his own hand. Then he looked at Saitama, and what was in his eyes in that moment, stripped of the armor of certainty, stripped of the philosophical architecture, stripped of the centuries of cultivated impassivity, was something raw and genuinely unfamiliar, something that didn't fit cleanly into any emotional category but that contained elements of several. The way a color can be a mixture of other colors without being simply reducible to them. There was anger in it, the deep and fundamental anger of a being whose will has been interrupted at its most critical moment. There was something that might have been confusion, not the tactical confusion of a plan going wrong, but the deeper confusion of a worldview encountering a fact it cannot incorporate. And there was something else, underneath both of those, something quieter and more troubling, that was in the neighborhood of recognition. The same thing that the conversation had begun to stir, now pushed closer to the surface by the simple physical reality of being stopped, actually stopped, for the first time in his existence, by a hand around his wrist. "You can't hold this forever," Thanos said, and his voice was steady. He had too much discipline for it not to be, but the steadiness was the steadiness of effort now rather than the steadiness of natural ease, a distinction that everyone listening could feel even if they couldn't have articulated precisely why. "The universe requires this. What I'm doing is necessary. Release my hand and let the work be completed." Saitama looked at him. "I've been holding it for about 4 seconds," he said, with the tone of someone gently correcting a minor factual error, "and I wasn't planning to let go." "Then you're choosing the suffering of trillions," Thanos said. And this was the argument, the real argument, the one he had been making to himself and to anyone who would listen for longer than most civilizations had existed. The argument that had survived every counter-argument and every defeat and every loss precisely because it was built on a foundation of real observation, real mathematics, real consequence. Resources were finite. Life was exponential. Suffering was the result of the mismatch between those two facts, and his solution was the only solution that actually addressed the root cause rather than just delaying the inevitable. "The universe is dying under the weight of its own life. I am the only being willing to do what the math demands." "I don't really do math," Saitama said. And then, before Thanos could respond to that, before anyone could speak or move or process what was about to happen, Saitama did something that was technically very simple and in practice completely unprecedented in the history of either universe. He took Thanos' gauntlet hand, the hand with all 6 stones, the hand that had broken the Hulk and carved through armies and held the architecture of the universe within its grip, and he bent it, slowly and without particular effort, back toward Thanos. Not violently, not crushingly, but with the steady, inexorable, conversational pressure of someone closing a door that has been left open too long. The gauntlet crumpled inward around the stones. Not catastrophically, not an explosion, not a detonation, but structurally, the forged star metal folding under a pressure it was not designed to resist, the stone settings deforming, the channels that connected the stones to each other and amplified their combined output buckling and breaking contact. And as the connections broke, the stones went dark. One by one, not destroyed but disconnected, their power still present but no longer in concert. No longer networked into the singular convergent instrument that made the snap possible, reduced from the most powerful weapon in the universe to 6 very impressive individual objects held in a hand that was no longer able to close. The snap didn't happen, not because Saitama blocked it at the last second in a dramatic, wire-fu slow-motion heroic intervention, but because the mechanism for the snap no longer functioned, folded inward by a grip that treated the greatest weapon ever constructed approximately the way you would treat an empty soda you were about to throw away. Strange lowered his hands. Tony's weapons went offline. Peter Parker sat up in the rubble and stared. The silence that followed was the silence of an outcome that nobody had rehearsed for, not the heroes and not the villain. The silence of a universe that had been holding its breath for so long that it had forgotten what exhaling felt like, suddenly, without ceremony or fanfare or a triumphant musical swell, being allowed to breathe. Thanos looked at his hand, at the crumpled gauntlet, at the stones, still glowing faintly but separate now, disconnected, 6 points of light where there had been one unified blaze. He looked at them for a long time with the expression of a man standing in a house he has spent his entire life building, watching it settle into the ground. Not a sudden collapse, not a violent ending, just the slow and final and completely irreversible arrival of an outcome he had made every conceivable sacrifice to prevent. Saitama let go of his wrist. He stepped back. He looked at the gauntlet, then at the sky above Titan, then at the assembled heroes of the Marvel Universe who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from stunned to reverent to the specific face Tony Stark made, when he encountered something that broke his model of the world, and he hadn't yet decided whether to be grateful or annoyed about it. Saitama said, quietly to himself, with the specific intonation of someone who has just done a thing, and is in the process of checking whether the thing produced the feeling they were hoping for, running a quick internal inventory, waiting for the result to come back. It didn't come back. Or rather, it came back the same way it always came back, with the same answer it always gave, the same familiar silence where the feeling was supposed to be, the same hollow echo of an achievement that should have meant something, and simply, stubbornly, didn't. He put his hands in his pockets. The aftermath of an averted catastrophe has its own specific texture, different from victory and different from survival in the ordinary sense, because victory implies a contest that was genuinely in doubt, and survival implies that the danger was real and personal and felt, and what had just happened on the surface of Titan didn't fit cleanly into either of those categories. The heroes of the Marvel Universe were alive, and the snap hadn't happened, and the gauntlet was crumpled in the hand of a being who was standing very still in the middle of a crater looking at 6 disconnected stones with the expression of a man who has just watched the last copy of something irreplaceable be destroyed. Not angry anymore, not calculating, not the terrifying, purposeful, cosmically certain Thanos who had carved a path of devastation across half the universe to reach this moment. But something quieter and more difficult to look at, something that didn't have the clean, dramatic shape of a villain defeated, but the messier, more human shape of a person whose reason for existing had just been removed from their hands by someone who didn't even seem to fully understand what they were holding. Nobody moved toward him. This was partly tactical. The gauntlet was damaged, but the stones were still present, still powerful as individual objects, and Thanos was still Thanos regardless of what he was holding. But it was also something else, something harder to name, the instinctive hesitation that arises when a being who has been a force of nature for the entire duration of your experience of them suddenly looks, for the first time, like something other than a force of nature. Strange watched him from behind the measured calm of someone cataloging every detail for future analysis. Tony watched him from behind the faceplate of a suit that was running on reserve power and honest uncertainty in roughly equal measure. Nebula watched him from a place that was more complicated than either of those, from the specific vantage point of someone who had spent her entire existence being shaped by this being's idea of strength, and was now watching that idea stand in a crater and look lost. Thanos sat down. Not fell, sat, deliberately. The way you sit when standing has stopped being something you're doing with purpose and started being something you're doing out of habit, and the habit has run out. He sat in the rubble of Titan, in the ruins of the civilization whose collapse had started all of this, surrounded by the people who had come to stop him and had mostly failed until the universe had sent something through a crack in reality that none of them had asked for, and none of them could explain. And he looked at the stones in the damaged gauntlet with the specific quality of attention that is less observation than reckoning. The internal accounting that happens when the story you have been telling yourself about your own life is forced into contact with a version of events that doesn't confirm it. The conversation with Saitama was still moving through him. Not the physical exchange, the hits, the stone activations, the crumpling of the gauntlet, but the words, the questions, the specific and guileless directness of a being who had no investment in the outcome of Thanos' self-assessment, and therefore no reason to be anything other than honest. Did it feel like anything while you were doing it? The question kept returning, not because Thanos didn't have an answer, but because the answer he had kept producing, purpose, certainty, peace, kept failing to fully convince the part of him that was doing the asking, the part that had been sitting quietly underneath the philosophy and the mission and the centuries of cultivated righteousness, waiting for a moment of sufficient stillness to make itself heard. He had sacrificed Gamora. He had held her over the edge of that cliff on Vormir, and he had let go, and he had felt something in that moment that he had immediately and completely filed under the category of necessary cost, the price of the work, the evidence of his commitment, because to file it under any other category would have required him to examine what the work actually was, and what it had actually cost him, and whether the accounting, when done honestly, came out the way he had always insisted it came out. He hadn't done that examination. He had filed it and moved on and told himself that the tear on his cheek as he walked away was grief converted into purpose, sorrow weaponized into resolve, which is a thing that sounds like strength but is in practice a very sophisticated way of not feeling what you're feeling. Saitama was not watching any of this. Saitama had turned away from Thanos the moment he stepped back, not dismissively, not with the theatrical indifference of someone making a point, but with the genuine and slightly distracted turning away of a person whose attention has moved on to the next thing, which in this case appeared to be the sky above Titan, which he was examining with the mild, unhurried curiosity of someone who has found themselves somewhere unfamiliar and is taking a moment to note the differences from home. The sky above Titan was extraordinary, the suspended debris of the shattered moon catching the light of a distant sun, fragments of rock and ice hanging in the thin atmosphere like a slow-motion explosion frozen partway through, the kind of view that would stop most people in their tracks and hold them there for a long time, and Saitama looked at it for about 15 seconds before apparently completing his assessment of it and moving on. Tony Stark approached him. This was, in the context of Tony Stark's entire history of interactions with unknown powerful beings, an unusually direct and unusually undefended thing to do, and it said something about what he had just witnessed that he did it without activating additional weapons or running new threat assessments, or doing any of the preparatory things he normally did before approaching something he didn't understand. He just walked over and stood next to Saitama and looked at the sky for a moment alongside him, and then said, "I'm going to need you to explain what you are, because my entire system keeps returning inconclusive, and I find that personally offensive." Saitama looked at him, at the suit, at the damaged faceplate, at the general impression of a man who had been through something significant and was processing it by asking technical questions, which was apparently his primary coping mechanism. "I'm a hero," Saitama said, "for fun." Tony opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "For fun," he repeated, with the specific intonation of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that their brain is refusing to file anywhere useful. "I mean, I do it as a hobby," Saitama said, and then appeared to reconsider the accuracy of that framing, tilting his head slightly. "Or I used to do it because it was exciting. Now I mostly do it because—" He paused for a moment, looking for the word with the same careful searching expression he had used before, the expression of someone who values accuracy over impression. "Habit, I guess. And because people need help sometimes." Strange had drifted closer during this exchange, not intrusively but with the careful, orbital approach of someone who wants to be within earshot without making it a confrontation, and he was listening with the full depth of his attention, which was considerable. He had been piecing together a picture of Saitama from everything he had observed: the physical immunity, the structural impossibility, the conversation with Thanos, and now this. And the picture that was assembling itself was one that he found genuinely, deeply, and somewhat troublingly fascinating, because it described something that his entire framework for understanding power and heroism, and the relationship between strength and meaning, had not previously accommodated. "The crack in reality that brought you here," Strange said, addressing Saitama directly for the first time, his voice carrying the measured precision of someone choosing their words with the care of a person who knows that imprecise questions produce imprecise answers. "It was produced by the energy of the gauntlet at full power. The fracture should seal itself as the stone energy dissipates." He paused. "You'll be returned to your own universe, likely within the hour." Saitama nodded, processing this information with equanimity. "That's fine," he said. "I need to get groceries." And then, because this statement apparently required context that he felt was worth providing, he added, "There's a sale on at the store near my place. Ends today." The silence that followed this was the silence of every person present, Strange with his mystical arts and his 14 million futures, Tony with his genius-level intellect and his powered armor, the assembled Guardians and Avengers who had fought and bled and strategized across years and galaxies to reach this moment, collectively processing the information that the being who had just stopped Thanos, who had walked through 6 Infinity Stones without visible damage, who had crumpled the most powerful weapon in the universe like an empty can, had a grocery list and a time-sensitive discount he was trying to get back to. Peter Parker, who had made his way across the rubble and was now close enough to be part of the group, looked at Saitama with the expression of someone who is 17 and has been doing this superhero thing for a couple of years and has not yet lost the capacity for genuine, uncomplicated awe, and said, "That was the most incredible thing I have ever seen," with the direct, unself-conscious sincerity of someone who hasn't yet learned to be cool about their admiration. Saitama looked at him. Something moved in his expression, not the full warmth of someone who is accustomed to being seen and appreciated, because he wasn't, because the particular quality of invisibility that came with being so overpowered that your victories looked effortless meant that almost nobody ever recognized what they were watching when they watched him. But something quieter and more tentative, the very early and very careful opening of something that had been closed for a long time. He looked at Peter Parker's open face and his genuine eyes and the uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet learned to be strategic about where he aimed his appreciation. And for a moment, just a moment, brief and fragile and almost imperceptible, something in Saitama's expression shifted away from the baseline of vast, hollow patience that it normally rested at, towards something that was in the neighborhood of being seen. "It wasn't that hard," he said, which was true, and which was also in the specific context of everything that had happened and everything that had been said, and everything that Saitama was, and everything he had lost in the process of becoming it. One of the saddest true statements anyone had ever made on the surface of a dead planet in any universe. The crack in reality opened again. An hour later, approximately where it had been before, a tier in the air above the surface of Titan, edges shimmering with the residual energy of a universe reasserting its own boundaries, reality knitting itself back together around the wound that the gauntlet's power had made. Saitama looked at it with the expression of someone who has been given their ride home and is ready to take it, checked briefly that his cape was still attached, and began walking toward it with the specific unhurried pace of a man who has somewhere to be but isn't late yet. Strange watched him go, Tony watched him go, the Guardians watched him go. Peter Parker watched him go with the expression of someone trying to memorize something before it disappears, storing the details carefully against the possibility that he will want to return to them later, which he would. He would think about this day many times in the years that followed, would try to explain it to people who hadn't been there, and find that the explanation always fell short. Would turn it over in his mind looking for the part that would eventually make complete sense, and find instead that it remained what it had been in the moment, something true and strange, and not entirely reducible to any framework he had available. What the Marvel Universe had been saved by was not a plan. It was not sacrifice, not strategy, not the accumulated heroism of years of training and loss and growth. It had been saved by an accident of interdimensional physics that had deposited a man with no ceiling in the middle of a crisis that required exactly that. A man who had one not because he was braver or smarter or more motivated than anyone else, but simply because the concept of losing had, through the specific and melancholy process of becoming the strongest thing in existence, become structurally inaccessible to him. And that man walked through the crack in reality and went home and bought his groceries at the discounted price because the sale was still running when he got there. And he went back to his apartment and put the bags down on the counter and stood in his kitchen in his yellow jumpsuit with the scorch mark on the cape and the memory of 6 infinity stones flickering uselessly against him. And he made dinner, and he ate it. And he sat on his couch in the quiet of his apartment in a universe that could not challenge him and could not hurt him, and could not give him back the thing he had lost in the process of becoming what he was. And he waited, with the vast and patient and slightly weary equanimity of someone who has learned to wait, for something, anything, to feel like enough. Outside his window, the city hummed and glittered and continued its complicated, beautiful, mortal business of being alive, full of people who had no idea how close the universe had come to losing half of them, full of danger that was real and stakes that were felt in fights that could genuinely go either way, full of everything that Saitama had trained so hard to protect, and in protecting had placed permanently, irreversibly, just out of his own reach. He turned on the TV. There was nothing good on. He turned it off. He waited.